if there's any sort of universal affliction right now in the 21st century for all of us, it's the affliction of meaninglessness,
Mhm. Yeah.
the fear that we're not here for a reason, especially as we grow sort of further away from our roots or from sort of a shared culture or religion or, way of thinking. There's a fear that we don't know why we're here,
Mm.
and that's terribly disorienting, to wake up every day with the vertigo of not knowing what you're doing and why.
Mhm.
And I think that one of the things that tarot does for us is help us find a way to figure that out for ourselves.
Welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio, exploring the frontiers of spirituality, consciousness, the esoteric, and humanity's sacred relationship with the living earth.
I'm your host, Nick Mather, and in this episode, I am joined by author T. Susan Chang to discuss her latest book, The Living Tarot. Susie talks about her realization that you can't teach anyone tarot, but you can teach them to teach themselves by helping them discover how tarot speaks to them. She discusses the relationship between tarot and magic, the many ways one can work with tarot, and the power of engaging with the cards in a spirit of play. Also, please be sure to like and subscribe to this podcast on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. Your support is truly appreciated. T. Susan Chang is the author of Tarot Correspondences, Ancient Secrets for Everyday Readers, 36 Secrets, A Decanic Journey Through the Minor Arcana of the Tarot, and co-author with her Fortune's Wheelhouse Esoteric Tarot podcast co-host Mel Moline of Tarot Deciphered, Decoding Esoteric Symbolism in Modern Tarot. She is the creator of the Arcana Case for Tarot decks and teaches The Living Tarot, an online tarot course. Susan joins me today to discuss her latest book based on her tarot course, The Living Tarot, Connecting the Cards to Everyday Life for Better Readings. Susie, welcome to Rebel Spirit Radio.
Thank you so much for having me, Nick. It's an honor to be here.
Well, thank you. I am a huge fan of your work. I've told you that I've been following your work for a number of years. So I'm going to do my absolute best not to fanboy out on you, but I am so looking forward to this conversation.
I am as well.
Okay, wonderful. So I thought that we might begin with a little bit of your background and how you came to tarot. What drew you to tarot for any of my listeners who may not be familiar with you and your work.
Yes. So I first encountered tarot actually, I'm saying tarot because you said tarot, but I normally say tarot.
Oh, okay, yeah. Okay.
I first encountered it in college, and it had never occurred to me that I would touch a deck of cards other than for playing card reasons. But I had a roommate, or rather a neighbor down the hall who had a deck of her own, and she became obviously the center of attraction of the sort of galaxy center of the entire dorm because of her ability to read these cards. And at the time I thought, no way, there's too many of them, I don't understand it, plus I'm educated, that's not what I'm going to do. So but in time, after many readings, like everybody else, just constantly angling for reading, I began to see that this was an incredible sort of intellectual feat that she'd accomplished, and at least I had respect for that. But I still personally did not get into tarot until my 20s. And unlike you started around 16, which I admire, and I wish that I'd had the foresight to do so. I started when I got back to New York, which is where I'm from. I got back to New York, had my first couple of jobs, and started just trying all sorts of things, that initial sort of like Mennonite Rumspringa when you're released from all of your expectations and authority for the first time. And for me, it was dancing, ballroom dancing, and playing the saxophone and learning tarot. Those were the three things that I did at that age. And I was just hooked, from the first moment. I stayed in the closet for a good 20 years, but but in the closet with me always were my cards.
Yeah. Yeah, very good. So was there a moment that you had this sort of like, wow, there really is something to this?
Yes, absolutely. Like the very first day, really,
Mm,
when I picked up the cards. And I had occasionally like gone to a reader and, and had my fortune told, or
mm,
just had sort of what were really therapy sessions
mm,
with with a very good reader in New York. But when I finally got my own cards, the first thing that happened was I kind of picked up the deck, and I felt a something from the deck physically, I mean. And I was like, that's curious. What's happening? And to me, it felt almost like there was an electric current running through the deck,
mm,
through my hands holding the deck. And I thought, okay, well, whatever that is, that feels like something. And the first card that I ever drew from a tarot deck of my own was the Queen of Swords. And
mm,
at that time, the Queen of Swords was really meaningful for me. I really identified with the Queen of Swords. And actually, interestingly enough, there's a whole sort of current thing going on in the tarot culture where tarot readers identify with the Queen of Swords.
mm,
But I didn't know that back then. And I, and she kind of like just fell out of the deck. And then the very first time I did card of the day was 3 days later, and I got Queen of Swords. So, so there, by then I was just sort of like, okay, I think there's something here, and I'm going to just open my mind to it and see what happens, which I later realized is kind of the best recipe that I know of for engaging with tarot generally.
mm.
Just see what happens.
Right, right. So you say that the tarot readers are kind of connecting or relating to the Queen of Swords.
Yes,
And
it's sort of through the Jungian typology, actually. There's every once in a while, someone will run a Myers-Briggs test on a tarot community, and like the majority of the tarot readers will come up as INFJs. And INFJs, if you kind of do sort of a Mary Greer style Jungian, breakdown of the 16 types and the 16 court cards, that's Queen of Swords.
mm,
So there seem to be a lot of people who, and I actually ran a survey of my own about 10 years ago on a tarot forum, probably about 7 years ago on a tarot forum, and asked, which of these 16 court cards do you most identify with? Queen of Swords,
wow,
like 60-70%, something like that.
wow,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I like the Queen of Swords too. So I was
Yeah.
kind of
Yeah.
curious.
She's great. She's
Yeah,
great. Yeah.
yeah, she is. But doesn't she have kind of a negative
Oh, for
reputation?
sure. Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you read the older interpretations for Queen of Swords, she's the one queen who is a little bit shadowy.
Mm,
She could be a widow or she might be divorced. She has kind of an identification with the off with their heads kind
mm,
of
yeah.
queenly archetype. And she's tough,
Hmm.
she's tough. She's associated with loss and grieving and Black Maria.
Mm,
But she's also, there's a sort of a gravity about her, but also a beauty and a lightheartedness.
mm,
She's incredibly witty. She's said to love to dance, and then if you go with the Golden Dawn correspondences, she is associated with the sign of Libra, which is the form of beauty that is symmetrical, basically
mm,
Venus in her more symmetrical form. So, and she loves to partake in brisk and revivifying conversation. So she's a talker, but she's fundamentally, and she doesn't take a lot of BS, but she's fundamentally
yeah.
fair-minded, I think most people
Mm,
find.
yeah. Well,
Yeah.
that makes sense for the tarot itself,
Mhm.
because I
Yeah.
think tarot is very kind of direct and often no nonsense.
Yes. Yes.
Although it can also be very ambiguous at times. Um,
That's right. Yeah.
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 And so when you began
Mhm.
learning the tarot, were you like everyone else just consulting that little white book?
Yeah, I did dive in with the little white book, but I didn't like it. I
Yeah.
didn't like what it was, the sort of prescriptiveness of the little white
Right.
book. And I got the pictorial key, Arthur Edward Waite's
Mm,
pictorial key, and same deal. It's like, well, there's more to life than what I'm seeing in this book.
right.
So I think the first real tarot book I got was Rachel Pollack's 78
Mm,
Degrees of Wisdom, and that was my Bible for a long
mm,
time, like many people. Second one, like most people, Mary Greer's Tarot for Yourself, so really those two were my kind of guiding stars right at the outset. But yeah, I think, I was just flailing along with it for many years, just trying to pick up whatever I could. I think at the time I was in New York, and Wald and Ruth Amberstone had the tarot school there, and I would go once in a while, but it was a very small operation at that time. They had like a Monday night or Tuesday night class, I can't remember. And I would just go and hang out just to be among other people who didn't think this was nuts,
Right.
but I think, and that's right. And that's where I bought from Ruth a copy of Robert Wang's Kabbalistic Tarot there. I cracked that thing and I was like, no idea what you're talking about. And I put it away for like 15 years.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that was one of my questions, is when did you begin taking that deep dive into the more esoteric qualities of the tarot?
Yeah. Well, right at the beginning, I think I kind of was looking for something like that. I think I really vibed with the astrological correspondences early on, and I found something somewhere that gave me some indication of what those were. I didn't know a thing about Thoth. I had a deck, but like many people, I was turned off by it, so I didn't use it. I certainly didn't know about, the Book of Thoth or 777 or, Liberty or anything like that. So I think, because love systems right away, I think I tried to swallow the astrological correspondences whole, and they must have come back up again because they didn't stick. And then, like, for a very long time, I just kind of put all of that aside, like, from like 2000 to like 2014 or so, I was busy with like, moving to New England and raising kids and trying to be a food writer and doing all these other things. And tarot just sort of went back into the closet as something I did with my friends and family. And that was it. So it wasn't until like 2014, 2015 that I just felt such a hunger for engaging with the cards again. And I discovered that there was an online community, and it was really the fact that there was community and people that I could talk to about the things I was interested in, and, and what this card could possibly mean, that really got me started again. And really this time for good. So it was at that point that I discovered Mel Maline's deck, just like you. I had a friend who had introduced me to Mel, and I was like talking to this friend constantly about Thoth and about correspondences and things like that. And it was in the course of talking to Mel, who, as it turned out, lives, only 35 minutes away from me, that I thought, very much a kind of learn by doing. How can we sort of absorb the symbolism and the correspondences of these images and reconcile them? The Rider-Waite-Smith, the Thoth, and eventually Tabula Mundi, Mel's deck as well. So that's how the Fortune's Wheelhouse podcast got started. And in the course of like organizing myself to get that podcast together, I realized that I had all these spreadsheets and there was nothing that just put them all in one place. And I really needed that. So that's where tarot correspondences came from. Really needed the resource, really needed a very like tarot-centric 21st century 777, basically. And fortunately, Llewellyn was nice enough to, offer me a contract and bring this thing into the world, which has been great. So it was all correspondences all the time for a while since then. But, and at that point, I was also reading in a shop for people. And for me, it's always been sort of like, on the one hand, sort of deep dives into, is esotericism and correspondences and symbol systems and whatnot. And on the other hand, actually reading for human beings, which is, quite different. And I wanted to try and reconcile those as well. So really, Tarot Deciphered is the book I wrote with Mel Maline is the print version of Fortune's Wheelhouse, and it's expanded out with myth and all these wonderful things that Mel went digging down in wormholes to find, and we both we just wanted to have the book. So again, but And 36 Secrets was me diving down my own wormholes with the 2 through 10 minors and trying to sort of apply Kabbalah and elemental and astrological information to the minor cards. But all along, I felt there had to be a way to, do what I do for people and show other people how to do that, or to bring the magic, the true magic of tarot, which is applied to people's lives. And I knew it wasn't through correspondences, because not everybody wants to like memorize the Sephirot and the decanic correspondences, and not everybody's into astrology, and yet I truly believe that tarot is for everybody. So at that point I really wanted to try and figure out a way to teach people tarot, and it was quite difficult, because from what I could see, it was almost impossible to teach people tarot, right? Because what are you going to give them a bunch of meanings, and they're going to have to memorize them? No, memorizing is the opposite of doing tarot. So I finally discovered, I guess, or deduced that even if I couldn't teach people tarot, I could teach them to teach themselves. And that's what the Living Tarot is about, is providing a framework for people to discover their own language of tarot, to make their own correspondences, to see how tarot lives and breathes in their own lives. So it's really more a way of looking at the world than, a pedagogy, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I actually had a line from the book written out here that you wrote: "You can't teach anyone to row. You can teach someone to teach themselves to row."
Right.
So thank you.
Right.
Yeah. Well, and it was interesting because very recently it was on another online forum. I think it was a Facebook Tarot group where someone had posted, and I noticed that this is a very common post, is like, how in the world do I memorize these cards?
Right.
Yeah. And so I responded, like, well, get Susie Chang's book. but I like, and I added a little bit more to that, in the sense that it is about developing a relationship with the cards. And I think that's so important, developing that relationship with the cards.
I think so too. I mean, it's sort of like, if you, oh gosh, if you are trying to work from the little white book, and and the little white book tells you that justice is balance, and you look around and like everything is balance, right? How does that help you in terms of figuring out whether to move to Wisconsin, or whether you should apply to to an IT position? None of this is applicable unless you start saying, okay, what does an IT position look like in tarot? What is Wisconsin? What does moving look like in tarot? These are things that you can figure out, right? Through the awesome power of metaphor and the human brain.
Yeah. Well, and I think it seems like foundational to the Living Tarot book and the course is that daily draw.
Yeah.
Because that's where you're going to start making those connections, right?
Exactly. And not only is it sort of like just fun, to see what tarot has to say for you, it's an invitation to create meaning out of something that you draw each morning. But tarot itself will tell you, right? You don't have to do this all by yourself. Sometimes tarot will be like, hey, you know what? It's 3 of Swords again because it's raining again, and you might not know that. You won't read that in any book, right? But then it'll just happen. It'll arise naturally. And if you keep track, which hopefully you do, of what happens when you draw the cards, then eventually patterns start to emerge.
Yeah. I liked something that you wrote in regards to this, because working with the cards and working with the images and kind of keeping track, it opens up the world in a way. And I think what you wrote was, you are teaching yourself to live as if you are in a poem or a work of art. And
That's
I
right.
really loved that.
That's right. Yeah. No, I really believe that. I think that, if there's any sort of universal affliction right now in the 21st century for all of us, it's the affliction of meaninglessness,
Yeah.
the fear that we're not here for a reason, especially as we grow sort of further away from our roots or from sort of a shared culture or religion or, way of thinking. There's a fear that we don't know why we're here, and that's terribly disorienting, to wake up every day with the vertigo of not knowing what you're doing and why. And I think that one of the things that tarot does for us is help us find a way to figure that out for ourselves,
Right.
and it's not going to do it for you, but it's a conversation that draws it out of you, draws the search for meaning out of you. And I don't think that there's really any substitute for that in a person's life, for the search for meaning. I don't really think you can get it from, no matter how much fantastic Netflix you watch, it's not going to do it for you unless you're engaged in the creative process of trying to make meaning for yourself.
Right. Yeah, absolutely. And so I'm curious, and I think I already know the answer to this question, but I'm going to ask it anyway. So you recommend doing a daily draw, and it can be 2 cards or as many cards as you want, correct? What about doing other readings for yourself? I've heard other tarot readers say, no, you can't do that. Or people say that it's so difficult to do.
Sure, both are true, I think. I mean, well, no, I mean, I do think you can read for yourself, but I think it is difficult sometimes because we have a tendency to project. I think it's normal. It's what makes it work. It makes it go. It makes the whole process of reading tarot go. But I think what's almost impossible to do, or what can be very difficult to do, is to read for yourself, because when you read for yourself, I think what the Jungians would call the electric light of consciousness, the ego is so deeply involved that it, drowns out the more subtle promptings, the starlight, the candlelight of, of the larger message. That said, I think it can be done. And I think it helps to read for other people a lot, because then you have the muscles to know what it's like to do that. The way that I find is makes it possible for me to read for myself, which I only do in sort of important situations, is number one, you want to, there needs to be some stakes involved. Like it has to be something that you really, really care about to actually get results. Number two, you have to build more meaning into it than you would for other people, because I think you have to like ritualize it. You have to like somehow signal to yourself that this is special. Whereas, when you read for somebody else, it's already special because they've come to you and they care a lot, and they may have paid a lot of money, so for yourself, you have to make it special. Number three, what I found, and I learned this from a student, actually, you can record the reading and use the second person. So as if you're talking to someone else. So, so you've received the 7 of Pentacles, and here is what this might mean pertaining to your situation, blah, 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 blah. And then, the reason being behind this is that you're much nicer when you talk to yourself. And also the flow of talking in conversation is something that we do in sort of you and I terms like that. Right. So that's the next thing I do. And then the final thing is, with the recording, I don't listen to it until like the next day or the 2 days later or something like that, just to create a separation between the reader and the person being read, which are both me, but hopefully I can, separate out those 2 parts a little bit enough to get a message across.
Right. Yeah. And I find sometimes that the answers I get are quite direct. And I'll give you 2 examples here, because one is also, there's this question of ambiguity.
Yeah.
So I had been thinking about going back to Colorado for a long time. I have lived in Southern California for 18 years. And several months ago, and it was late at night and it was very ritualistic, I did a 1 card reading, and I just asked the question, should I stay or should I go? And I got the Chariot.
That's pretty obvious.
Yes, isn't it though? And I thought, okay, there you go. And so, events kind of happened that led me back to Colorado, not
Yeah.
without a lot of, sort of heartbreak and so on and so forth. And after I arrived, and again, sometimes these happen in the middle of the night, when I wake up and the anxiety's there, I thought, okay, I'm going to do it again. I'm going to ask. And the question I asked this time was, did I make the right decision?
Oh, to which the only possible right answer is yes.
Well, but the card I drew was the Fool.
Just sassing you back there.
Yeah. And I could read that in a couple of ways, right?
Yeah.
As
Yeah.
I'm starting a whole new journey, or darn, you're a fool.
Yeah.
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 And that's where I find tarot kind of tricky and interesting, is in those different ways. And that's why I find reading for myself kind of so, again, tricky, because
Yeah.
there is that tendency to read what we want into the cards.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I think that's absolutely right. It is tricky. And and I also encourage people to, if there's a question you want to ask that only has one right answer, the answer is probably, the method to use is magic, not divination, right? Because, which are very similar, actually. They're so closely related. It's either reading symbol or writing symbol, right? And I think that, if there is the problem is that, like, if you try to ask a question where there's only one right answer, there's going to be a ton of projection onto that, right? There's going to be, like, you can feel the cards, like, working to give you what you want, and which you don't really want them to do. But but yeah, I think it's true. I think one of the most difficult things to ask, I mean, you were lucky that you got the Chariot for you. Here, should I move? Should I not? But one thing I found that helps a great deal with questions like that, when you get an ambiguous answer, like, what if you got, like, I don't know, like the Six of Cups, it doesn't really say anything about moving or not moving exactly. I've found that often it's helpful to split the question in two, like like a peanut or an Oreo. It's sort of like, what if I do it, or what if I don't, kind of a thing. And then something about drawing two cards provides, like, this contrast. It's like turning up the contrast on a photograph, and by seeing the difference between the two cards, you can usually triangulate which is the answer that seems to be more fruitful. But yeah, no, it's fascinating trying to do that. It's fascinating trying to read for yourself and to parse out the ambiguities. Another thing that I teach in the book is this technique I call priming the pump, which is basically, for whatever question you have, you imagine 4 or 5 possible answers, and you use your language of tarot to figure out what each of those would look like in tarot, what card would represent them. And by doing that, something about that puts your head in sort of metaphor gear, right? It helps you, for some reason, it helps you get ready to read whatever the final answer actually is going to be. Whether or not the final answer randomly drawn is one of those 4 or 5 that you posited, it's still going to make your brain, warm it up, like doing stretching exercises before you go to a run.
Yeah. I love the example that you gave in the book of how you did that with your son. And I think it was a Packers game.
It was a Packers game, right? Yeah. No, it's true. He was 16 years old, really into football, didn't care at all about tarot, and he just would talk about nothing but the Packers. And so I held out my cards and asked him, why don't we see who's going to win? But I primed the pump by saying, how are we going to know if it's the Packers who are going to win? And I asked him what color shirts they were, and he's like, jerseys, Mom. They're called jerseys. And apparently they wear green because they're the Green Bay Packers. And the only card I could think of that had a green shirt was the 7 of Wands. And I said, okay, kid, so if we get the 7 of Wands, they'll win. And, so I hold it out and he pulls a 7 of wands and they win. And it's great, and it even is like the game was even like the 7 of wands. It was like difficult and everything was against them, but they prevailed in the end through great determination and perseverance. Everything about it was like 7 of wands. And the question, of course, in hindsight is like, what would you have done if you'd gotten any other card of the 77 other cards? And my answer to that is that I don't know. I honestly don't know. And sometimes tarot is just weird and wonderful and gives you a freebie.
Yeah. Have you ever had an example where you do a reading either for yourself or for someone else and you're like, I don't know what this is telling me?
Sure. That happened all the time when I was starting out, all the time. And at the time, what I would do is what probably every new reader experiences. I would just like choose something to sort of like plant my flag on. And I would say, this is what it means. Or I would like stretch and stretch and stretch. If it wasn't resonating, I would like go a little further out there and plant another flag. And before you know it, I was like way out there on the end of the branch about to fall down. And neither of us had any idea what was going on, neither me nor the person I was reading for. And I think one of the things I've learned by doing readings as a professional for years now is, first of all, I don't come up dry quite as often now because there's just more in the well, but also that you shouldn't feel afraid to just say, I don't know. I don't know exactly what's going on here. And then to open it up to the other person, because honestly, no matter how experienced a reader you are, what they bring to the reading is just as important. What they see in the cards is every bit as important. They could have never read tarot like for their entire lives, never seen a deck of cards before. And yet, here's a card. Let's see. Page of Swords, and perhaps you look at this and they're like, oh my God, I just got these red boots and this is what it means to me. And this card is like the everything to me. So, you don't know unless you ask, and I think there's the pressure to seem like an expert is the enemy.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I like that. I like that a lot.
Yeah.
So when did you begin reading for other people? Did you begin reading right away?
Right away. Yeah, pretty much right away. I wasn't going to, but as soon as I got the deck, I couldn't stop talking about it. Right. So my friends are like, do a reading for me. And how could I refuse? Because I just wanted to hold the cards and talk about the cards. So yeah, I started reading for my friends right away. But for strangers, which I think is a different thing entirely, it took like maybe a year or two. I think what would happen was that I would take the cards everywhere with me, and sometimes people would just sort of like approach me. Like sometimes you hear about folks, I forget who does it, somebody takes his cards to airports and just has them out at the terminal and sees who approaches, which I think is great. So that was kind of similar for me. I would like be on a bus or a train and somebody would get interested. It still happens nowadays. But then I started reading in a coffee shop on Tuesdays in New York after a couple of years. And that was great. I just read for tips. I was living in the theater district, so people had stories on stories on stories, and they had lots of interesting problems. So I got a lot of practice doing that, just reading for tips on Tuesday nights for probably a year or two, something like that, before stopping. So when I returned to it, I think, it was like 2014, 2015 was the next time I actually went into that kind of situation again. I started reading for a local shop and just for people who came off the street. And that was really, really good for me for, again, recognizing what it means to use the cards in a way that's not totally up in your head, Yeah. And I recommend that everybody do it, even if you're shy or even like, if you're shy about reading for other people and somebody wants a reading, you do it together, right? You say, well, let's figure this out together. Let's draw some cards and see what we think together they mean.
Yeah. I used to work at a university in the engineering department.
Oh, wow.
And and I'm not an engineer by any stretch of the imagination, but one of the professors ran an international X-ray conference
every year. And I would go in the summer and work at the conference. And I would usually sit in the evenings back like in the bar
Yeah.
and with my tarot cards out, and I would do all these tarot readings for
engineers.
and scientists and everything. It was quite fun. And
That's fantastic. Were they open to it?
Yeah, they were. Yeah, and I would do it not for tips, but for beers or something. So,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah. You're probably pretty buzzed by the time you got out of there.
yeah. Well, I had to limit it, to how many beers I could accept. But yeah. But I also noticed that I wanted to ask you about this because you do talk a little bit towards the end of the Living Tarot about the ritual involved.
Mm-hmm.
And I had an experience where a friend once or twice a year would have all these women come in, her colleagues and friends, and there would always be a focus of what they were doing. And so one time she's invited me over. She said, well, we're gonna have you sit back in this room and you can do tarot readings for people.
Mm-hmm.
And I had never done anything like that. But by the end of the day, I had this raging headache.
Yeah. That's a thing.
Yeah. And it totally caught me unprepared.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally. Yeah. That it's sort of like reading for people opens you up, right? And it's like you basically have just an army racing through your sensorium for however many hours it is. And it's no surprise that you ended up with a headache. I think ritual's important in the sense that it sets a definite beginning and a definite ending so that at least you have a chance afterwards to sort of return yourself to yourself. My favorite ritual after reading for people is eating something. I think that some people say, have a little bit of salt. Oh my God, have some French fries, or something, something just to return your body to your body, to remind you that you're not just like this creature floating in the ethers. You are made of matter, all four elements, and bring you back into your body. I love that part about coming. I'm not always great about ritual honestly when I'm reading for other people, and I should be better, but I'm very good about ritual with the daily draw. So I feel like I'm slightly covered that way.
Okay. Well, good. So one of the other, I think, really important aspects to tarot is the questions that are asked.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And the formulation of the questions. And I think that this can go in a number of ways, but do you have an approach when someone comes to you and they want to seek some answer? I think most people want some kind of answer. Do you help them in any way formulate the appropriate question?
Kind of. I mean, I try not to interfere too much. I used to interfere a lot, and and then I had lunch with Rachel Pollack one day. I was, kind of went to Rhinebeck to worship at the Rachel Shrine and I took her out to lunch, and and I asked her that same very good question, what do you do to reframe the question? And she's like, who am I to, to tell them what question they should have? I just answered the question. So, so I've tried to be like Rachel, and I try not to reframe the question too much, but I do sometimes say, well, this is the kind of question I know I can answer. I feel like there are some questions I don't know how to answer. I don't know how to answer, whether your English teacher from 5th grade, approves of what you're doing. There's certain things that I don't really know how to answer lost object questions, but that's a whole nother thing.
Right.
But I feel like, the person genuinely comes out of a desire to know the answer to the question. And I really want to help. And some of the questions will lead to answers that will not really help, right? Like some questions, the question that you get all the time, about my health, is my health going to be okay? Well, what if you get the 5 of Pentacles, or what if you get the Death card, which is complicated, or which the the devil. I mean, there are certainly ways to read that, but I'd like to have a conversation with the person first and see if they're open to answering instead the question, what can I do to make sure my health is, vibrant and strong? I mean, again, that's definitely a question with only one right answer, right? So, so you can use tarot to help you figure out ways to get the answer that you want. You can also use magic, which is efficient, but it's not for everyone. So, so I will do things like that. I also, in terms of like the question that I sometimes get from people, like, can you tell me what person Y is thinking about me? That one I'm also wary of, because I generally feel that, there's a question, can you do it versus should you do it? Some people who are truly psychic say you shouldn't do it because that's unethical and you're spying. Some people say you can't do it because they're not there. I tend to lean more, since I'm not a psychic medium, I tend to lean more in the can't do it direction. But I also think, more importantly, that finding out what another person thinks of you is not always healthy. In fact, it usually isn't, even when it's something really positive. There's a reason that gossip is considered in some religions a sin, because it's toxic whether or not it's positive or negative. Like, to hear something about yourself is incredibly distorting, to your self-image. So, so I generally frame it in terms of like, I'm not sure I can do this, but what I can do is draw a card for you and a card for the other person and comment on the relationship and the dynamics between you and how we can improve that if it needs improvement. That is something I know I can do. So, I usually try to frame it in terms of what I'm able to do, as opposed to, that is a terrible question and you are a
Right.
terrible person,
Right. Yeah. Well, and I'm glad that you mentioned that question of, what does this person think about me? Because I get that a lot too. And that's one that I actually say, I'm not going to answer that. I can't, I'm not going to do that.
Yeah.
And what's always going through my mind is, what other people think about you is none of your business.
Yes. Yes, that's a wonderful way to put it. Yeah.
So I will try to help them reframe that question, like, what do I need to know about this relationship?
Yeah.
And
in fact, I think the what do I need to know about is a great formulation for almost anything.
Right. Yeah. That's my go-to. And also to avoid yes or no questions. Often, especially if you're doing more elaborate spreads.
Yes. What's funny about yes or no questions? So years ago, I asked the tarot to show me what yes looked like, and it gave me the Ace of Wands, which has since then been my yes card. And I asked, I was like, okay, well, if that's yes, there's probably a no. What's no? And it said Page of Swords reversed. And over the years, I've kind of come to understand that. But let me tell you this, which is that, on Wednesdays, like today, I have a Mercury altar, right? Because it's Hermes Day. And one of the things I sometimes put on my Hermes altar is a magic 8-ball. and so, I didn't do it today, but the last couple of weeks I had, and I was like, what would be cool to include in my planetary rites for Hermes Mercury thought would be to ask a yes, no question of my magic 8-ball. And for the last 2 or 3 weeks, every time I've been like shaking, trying to come up with a yes or no question. I cannot come up with a yes or no question for the life of me. I do not know. There's nothing that I want to know yes or no to. Or it's like, I would come up with a question. I was like, but there's only one right answer to that. Right. So there's very few things that strike me as an appropriate yes or no question to answer with the magic 8-ball. So I did do, like 3 weeks ago, I think I did the classic question, which I said before, there's only one right answer to, is, am I doing the right thing? Which, I generally try not to ask that question because it only has one right answer. But I did that time because I was feeling pretty desperate, and it said, yes, definitely. And I was like, thank you, magic 8-ball. That is exactly what I wanted to hear. And since then, it's been nothing but concentrate and ask again.
Just out of curiosity, other than the tarot and your magic 8-ball, do you utilize other forms of divination?
Well, yes and no. I mean, yes and no. I think there's a part of me that's always like a child, when you're a kid and there's like the skipping over the sidewalk, or it's like, if the light turns green now, then X, or if the cloud blows that way, then Y, there's some sort of low level mancy going on all the time, whether you like it or not. And I'm still like that. Like sometimes if I'm just sitting on a rock and I'll say, if the water ripples that way, then X,
Mhm.
so sure. But in terms of formal divination techniques, it's mostly tarot for me, with a few exceptions. Like when I have a lost object, I don't use tarot. It doesn't work for me. But I will sometimes use a deck called Psy Cards, PSY, Psy Cards by Maggie Kneen, which is beautiful. It's like a 32 card oracle deck. And I love that. And I've had some success. I've had some success finding lost objects of my own with that. And then with the other, I've dabbled in all the other divination systems without any of them sticking. But every once in a while, I won't get on a Lenormand jag or something. But if there is a big question that's way bigger than me, like an election or something, I will take them all out. So
Yeah.
like I did, it was like, this was, I may have done it for the 2020 election. I definitely did it for the 2018 midterms for some reason. I was very invested in that. I don't remember exactly why. And I called it Divinapalooza or Sortilegathon. And I took out like the geomancy stones. I took out the runes. I took out the yarrow stalks. I took out the Lenormand, and I think I had a couple other things as well. I didn't have a magic 8-ball at that point. I hadn't picked it up from the dump yet, but I took up everything, and they all gave pretty much the same answers. So so it was fun to do, and I would do it again for something like that. But I even used the Sibylla Oracle, I think, which is not something I ever use, but I think that they all can work. I think I don't think that tarot is better or more efficacious than any other. I think they all work. I think it's the same mechanism, the same sensibility, the same setup that we use in divination across the board. And you just find the one that works for you best.
Okay. Yeah. And speaking of the mechanism, this is like the big question, right?
Yeah, isn't it? Yeah.
Because you do address sort of tarot philosophy or the tarot worldview a little bit. What do you think that is? How does tarot work? How do you think it works?
Yeah, so the most helpful sort of way, I think, for me of thinking about it has sort of arisen over the last few years. I mean, my first sort of model that I like to use was the idea that there was a backstage behind reality, kind of a magical model where I think I got it from American Gods, frankly, from Neil Gaiman's book, where there's like a shortcut that Odin and Baldur take to cross the country. They go backstage through the magical universe. But I mean, I sort of felt that it was a good working model for divination and magic, because in divination, we kind of like go behind the scenes and to get information about what's happening in front of the curtain, what appears to be happening in front of the curtain, and that in magic we actually mess around back there. We change the lights and the props and things to make it look different in front. And I like that model because of the acknowledgement that everything around us is an illusion. That to me tracks. So I like that one. But another one that I've been working with lately much more is kind of the synchronicity model, which I like a lot from reading a lot of Jung lately. I like the idea that that we exist kind of in two realms at once, in the sort of linear causal universe, but also within this larger pattern which we can't perceive, this acausal order that transcends what we can take in with our five senses, and that and that it's without time, and that it's without the sort of A to B linear thinking that we find so easy to understand. So the example I often use for that is the idea of like our perception being sort of like a marble run where A causes B, causes C, causes D. It's one damn thing after another. Whereas, the model of a causal order might be something more like, if you can imagine a system of interlocked wheels where one moves, they all move, right? Just all of them everywhere all at once. So by looking even at one tiny part of that system, you get a sense of what's going on in the whole, which I think is similar to what we do in divination. We take this one tiny sample, like a core sample, and we get some idea of what's going on in the whole. So, in I think Marie-Louise von Franz's Divination and Synchronicity, she represents this as like the wheel of linear time, and then the sort of perpendicular wheel of eternal order, and that in the center is, where I think the oracle stands, the spiraculum aeternitatis, the breathing hole of eternity. So I think that's what we're doing there. I think that we, at the moment that we engage with the oracle, we literally take a reading of something much larger than ourselves and how we fit into it, which is why you can only do it once, for one subject, right? Because it's not an experiment, it's an oracle. It's not something that if you repeat it over and over on your linear causal wheel, you'll get more and more accurate results. It's the opposite. So I think of it as a religious act, as a sacrifice, as a and literally sacrifice meaning to make something sacred, to make it meaningful. So therefore, if you are to continue with the sacrifice model, if you're at the altar of the oracle, what you're sacrificing is your doubt. And in return, you receive meaning. This is because meaning and doubt exists in this sort of inverse relationship. So, so my belief is that like every tarot reading is like that kind of sacrifice where you exchange doubt for meaning. And then you don't do it again, because basically by doing it again, you would be introducing doubt into the process again and reducing meaning. So
that makes a lot of sense. And I like that. My friend, who I'm actually recording in her room, also reads tarot. And every now and then she will ask the tarot the same question over and over. And the tarot eventually will tell her, stop asking the question.
Yeah. Absolutely. I mean, it's like the old saying in school, you're only cheating yourself. It's like, you can get the card that you wish you got. You can make yourself get it. But if that's what you want, do the magic, work with the card as a magical object. And that's a better way of getting there than trying to pretend that you got it randomly.
Yeah. You've mentioned this a couple of times. So let me ask you to maybe expand on that a little bit. And that is that relationship between tarot and magic.
Yeah, I think it's fascinating. I mean, and this is like something that I feel like I can never learn enough about, is just our relationship with symbol. There's something so spooky about it, about the way that that symbols are fluid and interpenetrating and contagious, right? And the way that we can kind of negotiate with them to mean what we want. There's something really interesting, and the way that they can also like hold meaning for us as projection holders, right? Like you might put cayenne pepper in your chili because you like the taste, but in another context you can put it in your neighbor's footprint and chase them away. It's like, it's really interesting that the same mundane object can become sacrificial, can become full of meaning in a way that suddenly becomes magical. So to me, when we work with tarot, we have this incredibly rich vocabulary of images to work with that can mean all manner of things. And that is, part of the art of divination, is to figure out what's the most appropriate one for answering the question. But magically, we can also do that. Magically, we can take those same symbols and talk back and say, okay, well, this cayenne pepper, might have just been a tasty treat yesterday, but today it's trouble, right? And same thing with, with the Ace of Swords. Yesterday it might have meant that I got my glasses cleaned, right? And today it's a weapon, right? So I think that there's a creative willingness to work with the symbol to bring it alive in different ways. And I think that that's what magic must be about.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I love you talk about the sympathetic and the apotropaic magic.
Mhm. Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you gave a couple of examples in the book. And I think
Yeah.
I remember it may have been on the Fortune's Wheelhouse podcast where you talked
Mhm.
once about getting the tower and kind of
Yeah.
going down the stairs.
I still do from time to time. Oh man, it's getting hard in my knees. I'm getting
Yeah.
older. It's really hard to go head first down those stairs.
Yeah.
But yeah, I have done that. I will go head first down the stairs, reciting the Orphic hymn to Ares while chewing 5 peppercorns, just to stave off that. And I sometimes I just get lazy and I don't, and and I just drive extra carefully. But more often than not, what happens is that, like, I turn on the news as I'm driving carefully, and the first thing I hear is about an explosion somewhere. Right.
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 Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. But and I think that takes us also back to the sense, like with the tower has such a negative reputation.
Mm-hmm.
And it certainly has appeared in readings for me that way. But it
Yeah.
also has, I think, a positive connotation.
Oh, for sure. Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think, I also, one of the more positive things I associate with the tower is thunderstorms, thunderstorms, which I kind of love and which are necessary sometimes, after a long stagnant holding pattern in the weather. And I mean, they can be paradigm shifts as well. I haven't really seen that many powerfully positive tower instances in my life, I'm sad to say. But but on the other hand, I will often use sympathetic magic to bring it on, just cracking eggs, or my friend Alan will literally build up a Jenga game and and knock it over as his form of apotropaic magic. But yeah, I also give the example often of the 10 of Swords, where because I sew, I will go and buy sewing needles. But I got it so much this year that I just could not face another trip to the sewing store. So I just took my medicine.
Yeah. Well, and it's amazing how the cards will appear. I'll give you my example. When I was writing my dissertation, I had one of my dissertation committee members was a royal pain. His name was Robert. And every day that I would hear from Robert, I would get the 9 of Swords.
Oh gosh, that's funny.
and that became my my effing Robert card. Whenever I see that.
That's right. Yeah. And I think that's a great example of the way tarot is personal. It really is about the specifics of your life and how you react to your circumstances that tarot speaks to. There's nothing quite like it.
Yeah. Well, I also like the imagery or the way you were describing sort of this tarot worldview is, especially with synchronicity, is that it allows us free will. I mean, the cards are not just, this is exactly what's going to happen, is maybe to think about it as this is what's likely to happen now, but you still have agency within it.
Sure. I think that the cards kind of give us a sense of the quality of the thing, the general shape and smell of it. And there's a lot of wiggle room in there, to play with it. I honestly think that, that thinking creatively, and this could take the form of just creative mental engagement. It doesn't even have to be like painting a picture or, writing a poem or singing a song. I think that is magical in and of itself. I mean, I really do think that creativity is the basis, is the fundamental infrastructure, the lattice work of magic, and that tarot gives us a chance invites us to engage with that every day.
Right. And what are some other ways other than through divination that someone can work with tarot?
Yeah. Well, in terms of, magical practice, I think that there's a lot of things you can do. I did this whole thing on tarot magic last year where I was sort of creating talismans with tarot cards. And in fact, I still do some of that. I mean, it's something I want to do more of because I feel it's so rewarding. The commercial product I have related to that is the Eight of Wands stuff. I have lots and lots of Eight of Wands key rings, lots of Eight of Wands luggage tags, things like that, and they're great. But I think that you can work creatively with tarot cards in a lot of different ways. And one of the things I'll do is I'll have folks at the end of a reading, especially if they're kind of new to tarot and they're not, very programmed into the cards at all. I will say, okay, this card came up a lot for you. It seems to have a lot to say to you. Why don't you take that card and print it out and carry it around in your wallet for a while? Write things on the back of it, get to know it, become friendly with it, do some, if you have creative inclinations, do something creative with it. Another thing you can do is put a card under your pillow, and try and incubate a dream with it, which I think is great. You can meditate with a tarot card. You can enact a tarot card. That's an exercise I have people do in, I think, chapter 4, Walk the Walk, just to get to know it better. You can do a deck and walk, which is a thing that seems to be popular these days, which is what 36 Secrets is based on. The idea that you can spend 10 days with each of the minor cards, getting to know them, getting to produce art based on them, and kind of learning what they have to offer. Yeah, so I think I've been less. Some people will use tarot in sort of as a spur for narrative fiction, which I found I've never really read anything that didn't feel quite programmatic, doing that. But that's not to say it couldn't work. I prefer personally the spell work practice that I do every day, where I take the draw and I create something out of it. Like today, I got Page of Cups and Justice, and I wrote this spell, which is pretty silly. I don't even know what it means. Feather, finfish, silver scales, weigh your heart and trim your sails. I don't know what it means, but it has something to do with the Page of Cups and the little fish in their cup. And silver scales is both about the fish and the scales of justice, right? The idea of trying to sort of blur that together. And I like it when they're very concrete, but because they're concrete, they're abstract to my life. I don't know exactly what they mean. And that's my favorite kind of spell. Something that I can see an image in my mind, but I don't know exactly what it means for my day.
Yeah. Yeah. I haven't tried the spells yet. And I think the reason that I haven't is because I'm afraid that I would just kind of obsess over getting this, the wording and whatnot. And maybe just, being spontaneous with it would be a better approach.
Yeah. It's fun to just be kind of silly with it and see what happens, and with the understanding that you can always change it over the course of the day.
Right. Well, and I think maybe that's another key point is to play with the cards a little bit.
Yeah. I think that it's very constructive to engage in in a spirit of play with the cards. I think, one thing I think about all the time with tarot is the way that, it's serious and it's not at the same time. It's one analogy is sports. Like you care about sports a lot. Apparently people do, playing games that they really, really want to win. But then afterwards, it's over. It's a game. It's done, and there's a magic to the intensity of the feeling, and there's a magic to letting it go as well. So I think that the same thing in chaos magic, where, the idea is that you build up this working that's intensely charged with energy, and then does not matter, let it, need not be, right? Is what Peter Carroll would say at the end of that. And I think that there's something about that in magic generally, the intensity and then the letting go. And there's another sort of frame of mind that goes with divination specifically rather than magic, I think, that maybe just kind of, maybe that's the difference between the two of them. Because with divination, I think of it more as being engaged, but it's almost like those two states overlap, being intensely engaged, but not necessarily wanting anything, right? It's a negative capability kind of thing, right? Where you are intensely involved, but without a sense of lust of result, I guess, is what Peter Carroll would call it. And to me, that is why it's so much easier to read for other people, because you care, but not so much, right? It's not like you don't really have any skin in this game, right? Yeah.
Now, there's a question that I want to ask, and I've been thinking for a while now how to ask this question. I'm still not sure how to ask the question, but it's in regards to readings, and I would imagine maybe reading for other people. And it is that, do you find that when you read for other people, and this can also extend to other tarot readers and maybe some of the students that you've had, do you find that that the cards speak to them, or they work with the cards in a very specific way? And what I mean by that is, when I read for people, almost always the answer that, or what people will tell me is, you've just told me what I already know. And it seems to be more of a confirmation for them.
Well, that's interesting, isn't it, when that happens? Because they came to you because they didn't know. Right. And now they already know. So I think something's going on in the course of the reading where that's not a bug, that's a feature, right? You've told me what I already know. And it's like, yeah, you already knew. You actually already knew. And and it's hard when you hear that as a reader not to feel like you've somehow failed them, right? Because you wanted to surprise them with the big news. And honestly, most of the time nobody wants big news.
Right.
I think what people do want is certainty. And if someone is saying you've told me what I already know, then you probably actually did your job. Right.
Yeah. I never take it in a negative way. I actually saw it as very positive. This is, just confirmation. And the approach I usually take is, I always say, look, I'm not making any claims of being psychic. And, I'm just going to share with you what the cards say, what's there. And we can have that kind of conversation. And I even say, this isn't necessarily predictive. Sometimes it is. Sometimes
it is. Sometimes it is. Yeah. No, I think that's wise. I think it's wise. I mean, it's interesting, because usually, even when somebody comes to you saying, I don't know the answer to this question, they usually have a hunch in one direction or another. And sometimes tarot confirms that, and sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it sort of confirms their other hunch, And sometimes I think that one sort of way I like to frame it nowadays, which I think is very true to the experience of the person being read, is like, well, it sounds like there's a voice in you that's saying this one thing, and there's another voice that's saying this other thing. Let's let tarot give each of those voices a chance to speak, right? So there's a card for each of them. And I think that seems true to the experience. And one might be louder and one might be softer, or they might be in harmony with each other, or they might be fighting with each other. But it's sort of like, it's sort of like internal family systems. There's a way of at least putting the different parts of yourself in dialogue with each other, and externalizing that seems to be helpful.
There's no end to the mystery and depth, I don't think, of tarot. And
Yeah.
you'll never be done learning, will you? with
No, and that's
tarot.
what's wonderful about it, right?
Yeah,
It's sort of like tarot just meets you where you are,
right.
and it's a companion. It's like, I mean, it is an article of faith for me.
Mm,
It's like, you know, there's no end to it until there's an end to your life, really.
right.
And there's no end to the making of meaning
Mm,
until you go into the great meaning in the sky.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah. And that's something that I wanted to mention is when you were talking about, and I think that you refer to this in the book as that oracular moment.
Mhm.
Um,
Yeah.
that it seems like, you just mentioned faith, but it also seems like trust has to be
Yeah.
there as well.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, a willingness to accept that you are part of something bigger than yourself.
Right.
I
Yeah.
mean, and that's why I really love all of the metaphors for fate as sewing or weaving, the idea that we're just a thread in a much bigger tapestry. And, and I'm endlessly interested in that because I think, we live in a world of circumstance, and yet we are free to perceive those circumstances however we like.
Mm,
So there's this constant interplay of fate and free will that is just the dance of being a human being.
yeah.
And what I'll often say to people is that I think it's constructive to use the illusion of free will to deal with the illusion of fate,
Right.
right? Because neither of them is really in charge, right?
Right.
I mean, as in the human experience, we're going to just always be stuck somewhere liminally in the middle. And
Yeah.
that's the joy and the beauty of being human, I think.
Yeah. 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 We're never going to know. As a philosophy instructor, that always comes up, these questions of free
Yeah,
will and fate. And
yeah.
my answer is very similar to yours. Is like, I'm like,
Mm.
I don't know, but I have to pretend that I do have free will.
Exactly. It is, and that is why, I mean, I think that the spirit of play is not just, healthy and fun and appropriate for tarot. I think that's kind of life, the fact that you can't know and you have to pretend you do.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, yeah, yeah. And yeah, we have to deal with the uncertainties and learn how to surf those waves of uncertainty.
Yeah,
And I think that tarot helps us with that to a certain extent.
I think it absolutely does.
Yeah.
I think you're
Yeah.
right. Mhm.
Well, I know that we are starting to run out of time. So let me ask you just a few final questions.
Okay.
One is, and I don't know if I should ask this, but I'm going to ask it anyway. And the reason I don't know if I should ask it is because you have an entire course on tarot, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But we've mentioned the little white book that
Mhm.
comes with all the tarot decks,
Yeah.
and they are very incomplete quite
Mhm.
frequently.
Yeah.
But if you were to design a little white book for a
Yeah.
tarot deck, what would you do differently?
Yeah, that's a really great question that no one's ever asked me before. I would I would ask, what I would do if I had to do a little white book with something for every single card, I would design it in the form of questions.
Mm,
I think instead of being a description of what the card's supposed to mean, I would ask a bunch of questions for each card that might lead people in fruitful directions, but don't necessarily lead them there in as a leading question, right?
right.
Just a few open-ended questions. And you know what? People might hate that because it's
Yeah.
work, right?
Yeah.
It's work. Why didn't you just tell me what it means? But that's what I would do. And
Okay.
essentially that is the premise of the course as well, the idea of where do you see this in your life,
Right.
right?
Right.
Yeah.
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 Yeah, yeah. I've seen a few different little white books, but I've
Mhm.
never seen one that asks questions like that. And
Yeah.
I like that. I think that's a really good idea,
Yeah.
because it opens up to the reader themselves to start exploring. And that's
It's an
the point.
invitation. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. And
Yeah.
that's what you said, is that the tarot is an invitation.
It is. It is. I think that, and that was in said that in contrast to the idea that it was either prescription or prediction, right? That it was either,
Yeah.
that it was either going to tell you what was going to happen or tell you what to do.
Right.
But I like the idea that it's just there to have a conversation with you and to help you to make more of yourself,
Right.
to be who you're meant to be.
Yeah. And I think that that's the point of most divination. One of the questions you ask is who's on the other end.
Right. That is, to me, it's really so interesting because that's one of the first questions that people who don't know about tarot first ask, well, is it satanic, or is there, who do you think you're talking to? And, and I always thought it was kind of funny that the Golden Dawn, told you, well, it's the angel Shrew. Of course it is, right? And of course, maybe it is, but I think it is absolutely helpful to acknowledge that when you're talking, you're definitely talking to someone, there. And if you don't know who that person is, I think there's going to be a default. And so one of the things that I encourage people to do in the Who You Gonna Call chapter is to get beyond the default, right? Who would you like to talk to? Right? and that seems to work really well. I mean, if before you do all of the work of that chapter, I think, it's pretty good default would be best version of yourself.
Right.
That's a really good place to start. And then you can amplify it out with, Gandalf, Galadriel, Thor, whoever.
Right. Yeah. I usually just kind of generic spirit, I'm talking.
Spirit. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
One of the things I really liked about the book, and I've read the entire book, but I haven't gone through all the exercises yet. That's going to take a long time.
It's going to take a while. I still do the exercises.
Well, I found them so refreshing compared to other tarot books that I've encountered. But the other thing that I really liked about it is, your focus in the book is the Rider-Waite-Smith deck.
Mm-hmm.
But it felt to me like, there are so many different clones.
Mm-hmm.
And sometimes there are like minor differences that you could actually go through which each of those decks and do those exercises and get something new out of it.
You absolutely could. I mean, I think that, I think Rider-Waite-Smith was my go-to because, well, I love it. And it was my first deck, but also because there's it's kind of the genetic material underneath most of the tarot in the English speaking world. So if you have Rider-Waite, then you have a good start on pretty much everything else. Yeah.
And the book wouldn't work so well with like the Thoth based decks.
Sure. Yeah, no, it's like, I think that like with Thoth, it's so, Thoth is so correspondence based, and it's so, I think there's something about seeing human figures in the cards that makes Rider-Waite-Smith instantly relatable.
Yeah. Well, in the Thoth, it seems, it's so esoteric.
And
what I really like, and I think this is a good place to kind of start ending, is something also that you wrote, which is that every day is ordinary and every day is magical. And I think that the Rider-Waite-Smith deck really kind of encompasses that. Whereas the Thoth deck is more, it's like, oh, that's all magic.
It's all magic. It's all magic all the time. Yeah. No, I like Thoth a lot. I've come around after doing the Fortune's Wheelhouse podcast and being basically self-educated and educated by Mel, to really understand it in and out. I found, what's really interesting is that like when we did client readings for Fortune's Wheelhouse, which we did a lot of, we would read it with Tabula Mundi, but I would be reading it, with in the back of my mind, Rider-Waite-Smith in my mind and a little bit of Thoth. And she would be reading with Thoth in the back of her mind and a little bit of Rider-Waite-Smith. And we would still come up with the same conclusions, right? It's, you get there in a slightly different way, but that was really instructive because I'd never done that. You never really get a chance to compare and contrast how someone coming from an esoteric background versus somebody coming from a non-esoteric background, would read the same card and you can actually get to the same place.
Yeah. Well,
Yeah.
I personally loved it when the two of you would do that,
Yeah.
because you don't often hear two people interpreting tarot cards, right? And so I think
Yeah.
working together, it was really beneficial.
It was really interesting. I don't think we ever came up with like opposite meanings,
Right,
Yeah. It was
Yeah.
interesting.
Yeah. No, I have sent a lot of people to the Fortune's Wheelhouse podcast.
Oh,
It's
good.
yeah. As many as
Yeah,
I
no.
can. Yeah, that's
It
usually
was
the
a
first thing
great
I
thing to
say.
do. It was so much work and I loved all of it because, and now I still listen to it because I don't remember everything we said,
Right. Right.
That
Oh yeah.
was just like,
Yeah. I go back and listen too.
yeah.
So, yeah, it's wonderful. It's a wonderful resource, and your books are incredible resources too.
Thank you so much.
So let me ask you, what are you working on next? What's coming up for you?
Yeah. So the next thing is Jung, I think. I am going to be doing, well, actually, the very next thing is Atlas Obscura. An Atlas Obscura I've got going on probably in October. I do a sort of a mainstream tarot course for Atlas Obscura twice a year. I think I'm going to be doing that in October. And then I've got something for DC Young, I think, Washington Young Society of Washington, and in January. And I have in November Young Platform. I'm doing something for Young Platform. I'm doing a 4-week thing. And then in between I do a lot of presentations. I'll be at Northwest Tarot Symposium in October. And then I'll be at StarCon in January. Usually during the fall, I write books. I don't know if I'm going to do that this year. I feel like I'm not quite ripe yet. I want to do something on symbol and elements and 4 elements, but I'm not entirely sure it's gestated enough. So I might wait another year. We'll see.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, where can people go to find out what you're working on and to get the tarot cases and the
Yeah.
online course and just general information about you?
Yeah. So the sort of central clearinghouse is tsusanchang.com. And that's where people come for primarily for readings and class. So the class, as opposed to the book, this is basically the textbook for the Living Tarot class. The difference between the textbook and the class is that if you take the online class, then you get, feedback from me on the 8 big assignments. And there's a monthly Zoom meeting where we do new spreads and, talk about synchronicity, how cards show up in people's lives. And then the third thing is that if you take the online course, then if you graduate, then you get a 1-question reading from me at the end. That's the graduation present. So there's all that. And also if you buy the book, then you get the price of the book off the course. So that's great. That's a great incentive to take the course if you have the book. Now, so tsusanchang.com is where all of that is. I also do through that site, I do mentorship and readings. So readings, you can buy in for an hour or like a half an hour if you're a return customer. But also more importantly, and I want to make sure people know this, there are mentorship sessions, which I keep the price low on because I really want to help people learn to read tarot if they're having difficulties or if they have spreads they're confused about or cards they want to talk about or just struggling generally with tarot. I try to make that available to people. And then, so besides the website, the other one is my Etsy shop, which is etsy.com/shop/tarotista. So that's where you can get the cases. And also I do perfumes, which I do a ton of nowadays because there are zodiacal perfumes for the 12 signs, but there's also custom work. So people will send me their sun and moon and rising, and I'll custom design a perfume for them. That's really fun. It's a creative act that we do together. And so, yeah, that's pretty much it. I guess I do have a Redbubble shop, but there's not a ton there. And I think you can get to it through my website. The only thing that's really fun there that I tell people about is the 9 of Swords blanket.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I saw you posted that in the
Yeah.
Facebook, the Fortune's Wheelhouse Facebook. I loved that.
It's really great. It's really so much fun. But yeah, I mean, I whenever I'm feeling particularly Nine of Swordsy, I will curl up in that blanket, and it does make me feel better.
Yeah, 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 yeah. The effing Robert card.
Effing Robert, exactly. Should send him one.
Yeah, yeah. No, I'm not going to send him anything.
And it's
All
so
right.
appropriate too, because, I mean, from my point of view, I associate that card with writing and the demons
Yeah.
of writing. And
Mhm.
that was your dissertation. So
Yep.
that seems to really track.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. It tracked in so many ways. So many ways. So, well, Susie, thank you so much for your time today. It's been an absolute delight speaking with you, and I am so grateful for your time.
Oh, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed it as well.
And that's a wrap on episode 95 of Rebel Spirit Radio. Thank you so much for listening or watching if you are part of my YouTube audience or view this on Spotify. Before anything else, I would like to give a shout out to my latest patron, Colleen Costello. Colleen, thank you so much for your ongoing sponsorship and belief in Rebel Spirit Radio. I'd also like to thank Dr. Sharon Kogan for her very generous donation to the podcast. Sharon, you've been an inspiration to me for over 25 years now, and I'm so very grateful for your ongoing encouragement, your friendship, and your support of the podcast. So, to both Colleen and Sharon, words just do not do justice to how deeply thankful I am to both of you for your generosity of time and money and your belief in what I am doing here. You are both truly rebel spirits. For anyone else who would like to support my work here on Rebel Spirit Radio, and please support my work, you too can become a patron. You can find the link for the Patreon in the show notes or video description. Some of the perks for patrons include early access to videos, shout outs to members, a members only Facebook page, access to the Rebel Spirit Radio Discourse server, and a monthly book club where we explore books discussed on the podcast, spiritual and philosophical classics, and books related to the cocktail apocalypse. I mean, remember, I am a professor of philosophy and religion, so consider the book club an ongoing classroom where you can go as deep as you'd like with me and other rebel spirits. And of course, if you'd like to make a one-time donation, you can still do so via PayPal. I still have big plans for the podcast and the YouTube channel, so right now this is all a labor of love. So your support will not only help me in continuing what I do here, but will also help me grow the channel and the podcast. I'll be tremendously grateful for any support you can provide. Another way that you can help the podcast is to share it with friends, family, coworkers, and share it on social media too. That really is one of the best ways you can help and support the podcast. Help me grow my audience. As I always like to say, I'm out here doing missionary work in regards to religion, spirituality, and ecology, psychedelics, and consciousness, and how all of this can help us heal humanity's relationship with the sacred earth. So if you feel moved by the rebel spirit, and I sure hope that you do, please, by all means, help share the good news. Also, if you enjoyed this podcast, please make sure to give it a positive rating on whatever platform you use to listen to or view podcasts. It only takes a second, and your 5-star ratings really do help, especially if you listen on Apple. If you have a minute to spare, please consider posting a short but positive review. And please subscribe. For those viewing on YouTube, please give this video a thumbs up and subscribe to the channel. Make sure you hit that notification bell so you'll be informed when I upload new content. I'm Nick Mather, and you've been listening to or watching Rebel Spirit Radio. Until next time, may you be in peace, may you flourish in all possible ways, and may you continue to nurture your rebel spirit.